Thank you. So let's get right into it. And there's maybe a little bit of animation in this one. Here we go. So the big data priority recommendations in the reports we've shared is actually really a puzzle of really important pieces that all come together to give the entire picture around big data and how to deal with that, including the Darwin EU you'll hear about in a bit, and other initiatives that we are progressing on, including the analytics capabilities and the network processes of analyzing data in our decision making going forward. So these 11 recommendations, as you see them here in the puzzle, next slide please, are gladly all progressing on track. And this is a rather busy slide. I appreciate that, and I'll spare you for the details, and you can read them if you want to and follow some of our newsletters on the activities. There's just a number of initiatives and workshops and meetings that all need to go into the work we do on this, and we'll see in a bit how this working party representatives are actually being involved in the work that we do as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you a few highlights on the progress in September last year, I mean, as I just said, we are on track with the work plan as we have it. And we do continue to involve the patient and healthcare representatives as part of the Darwin EU Advisory Board, which have had a few meetings and recently had one again. We'll also have a look at the raw data analysis work, and the advisory group there also has representation from here, and the big data steering group meetings themselves as well. And just to highlight a deliverable that is actually quite important is the data standardization strategy that has been endorsed by the EMA Management Board and has been published now, that really leads the way on standardizing around data and the strategy around the data standardization as well. Then there's a consortium that has been selected now to deliver a draft EU data quality framework. We'll see in a bit from one of the workshops that data quality is one of the really important pieces as we talk data analytics, and we'll look across some of the data that we're going to utilize. You'll hear later on the Darwin EU Coordination Center has been appointed, so that will follow. We will take a deeper dive in a bit around two stakeholder workshops that we executed late November and early December last year, one of them being a learnings initiative for optimal use of big data for regulatory purpose. And then a multi-stakeholder big data forum that we have as a almost annual celebration in December with everyone who is actually involved in this ecosystem around drug development and use of data. And here we had substantial feedback from stakeholders that we're then obviously integrating into a work plan, our activities. So really, we take color out of these meetings to really inform us about what direction to adjust the activities in. And just for you to be aware, discussion on placing patient-reported outcome has been initiated at the EMA, which will, in a patient data workshop, be organized in June 2022, how to actually then take that into consideration for the continued work. There's an annual report in preparation right now that will be shared, and there's also a big data steering group newsletter that is, I think there's a copy featured on the EMA website. There's also a link here in the presentation for that. You would like to see that in details later. Next slide, please. And now we'll take a little bit of a deep dive into some of these areas, and although the title really doesn't give it away here, is the preparations in order to establish patient-level data analysis in relation to market authorization applications. And this is now where we start to move from, including with the Darwin EU, start to move from talking about what to do with data and actually using it and doing it. So there have been some designing and preparations for the pilot that has been ongoing until now, roughly, really based on learnings from a pre-pilot ran at the EMA, but also learnings at the HMA NCAs, including the Danish and the Dutch, and I know a few others have run the pilots. And this is really a technology change to consider raw data in the submission, much like what you see FDA is doing and the PMDA is doing and the Chinese NMPA is considering. A few pilots will be selected for these procedures. So, and these few pilots actually sum up to a total of 10 market authorizations that will be chosen on predefined selection criteria. So this is point 2 with Q2 and Q1 into 2023 in terms of the duration of these pilots. There'll be a range of different operating models for these pilots on raw data analysis that we need to consider, whether it's at the NCA level, the EMA level, a subcontractor, some of them focusing on the inspection work that can actually be informed about this availability of the underlying data that is being collected in the clinical trials by the market authorization applicants for the submission. And then obviously that will, in point 3, in early next year, lead to a key decision point and recommendations of how we can see this could actually benefit both the committees, but also the general decision making in our regulatory processes. So very much looking forward to that and what that will learn us. Next slide, please. In terms of learning, and this is a super busy slide, and I appreciate that, and I hope you'll take the time afterwards also to read the reports that come out. But we had 2 stakeholder workshops last year, which I alluded to, the Learnings Initiative and the Big Data Forum Initiative. At the Learnings Initiative, we discussed the fitness of real-world data for regulatory purposes, and also the importance of this should be integrated into the generation of how to generate real-world evidence. And then this is very, very important to consider data quality and validation of that data. And we really need to make clear that we need to broaden the scope of stakeholders to be involved in this work of the quality data providers, healthcare systems, and policymakers as well. So you get quality data in for your quality real-world evidence coming out of it. Also, the recommendations for using registries and the guidelines around that, and how that will be used for the real-world evidence generation. A clear understanding as well, I think, resonated throughout, and we've seen it a few times, the methodological skills in general are necessary for analyzing big data. We saw it in other workshops last year too. So it's really important that we support the training, not only of ourselves in the regulatory network, but also of the stakeholders. What does it actually mean with this big data? What does it mean with using the real-world data to generate the real-world evidence? A further important piece we discussed is what really is the value in real-world evidence is heterogeneity of results. Sometimes you get them due to technical issues or errors or misinterpretation, but the practice of providing treatment across Europe, and how that influences the use and the effectiveness and the potential safety around the drugs is super important. That requires a lot of work around metadata and data quality assessment to kind of tease out the desirable heterogeneity in this data from onboard. So really some important pieces here to continue working on. What we then brought forward into the meeting in early December was the general discussions around the 11 recommendations you saw earlier, talking to stakeholders that participate. And these 2 meetings were super well attended with several hundreds of participants from all sorts of you can argue, academia, healthcare professional, patients, industry, and so forth, and regulators, obviously. That a key important piece to consider, again, is data quality and representativeness. So it really represents the population of Europe as we'll look at it. The Darwin EU and what that will mean, and the regulatory processes itself, how we can actually rethink those, improve those. Obviously, also being very, very mindful about the European reference networks and involve these around rare disease registries, and establish a place for patient-reported outcomes. So I think we're moving that up on the agenda. Really want to make sure that we create transparency and collaboration beyond the analysis, so around the process and so forth. The clarity on regulatory requirements, you can definitely hear that resonating from industry as well, and data quality and processes there. And then being more precise around guidelines and guidance, best practices, which goes all around in terms of helping each other, but also giving clarity to those going to use big data and real-world evidence. And all of this, again, reminding us that the skill development go beyond regulators, also to patients, which was part of the discussion we had. The part as a results lessons learned should be more broadly discussed. We'll do that this year to bring this up into the workshops we are planning. Far more research and methodologies is definitely needed. We're just starting to learn this as we start to apply analytics ourselves. much to learn from academia here. And then just making sure, which is a high demand, that there's an EU convergence harmonization, but one that is global and not only EU. But this is actually a global need, especially as we talk some of these clinical trials as well, and including real-world evidence into the evidence submitted for market authorization application and the PRAC work afterwards and safety analysis and so forth. Next slide, please. So just, and a few animations here, I just asked the who controls the presentations just to go through them. I just wanted to highlight in terms of on this slides, if you just press next for the animation, I think this should pop up with a few highlights. Some of the key achievements here, we're really proud of ourselves that for many of these, we actually involved these working party representativeness on both the Darwin EU coordination selection and the advisory group, in particular on that. The EU network processes of the learnings initiatives were representatives were present, and including also the further discussions within our network capability to analyze, and that goes in particular for what we just looked at with the raw data analytics and the patient level data submissions and the pilots there. Then also the real world work here with international outreach and standardization and the stakeholder meetings as well in this area. And then obviously the second stakeholder meeting, again here with a representation from this working party and patient and healthcare professionals alike. Next slide, please. Again, a few highlights here too, where representation will be happening next year. So obviously with the establishment of the Darwin EU Coordination Center, again, here involving the patients and the healthcare professionals on this important development. The workshops that are being now pushed forward on the quality framework, data quality framework, and we'll see it on the expert advice and the real-world evidence guidance of this involvement, the European health data space development and data protection area as well, which is highly important to get both healthcare professionals and patients input to it. And then as we get later into the year, also the new multi-stakeholder forum with participation from this working party and patient and healthcare professionals. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we pride ourselves about that we actually made important progress on these activities in 2021. And where I'm really excited for 2022 is the establishment of the Darwin EU and the pilot of the clinical trials raw data analysis, which is really not only talking about data analytics, is actually doing it. So this becomes a really tangible deliverables and hopefully also future benefits for the work in the regulatory network and EMA. So very much looking forward to that. So I think I'll just leave it here for the summary of our work and forward looking points in, and then take a few questions if any should be there.